This is the second in our series of three, focusing on a story that every American needs to know about, the train to Crystal City. We in Harris County, of course, one of the things that we emphasize in our office, the Harris County Attorney's Office, the civil attorney for Harris County government, is that our true clients are the people of Harris County. And you notice I don't say citizens, because every person in Harris County has the need for the system to serve them in one form or fashion. And we do that through the other elected and appointed representatives of Harris County government. One of the things that some of you know is I try to attend every naturalization ceremony here in Harris County, and the League of Women Voters conducts about 10 a year at the Campbell Center over in Aldine School District. And they have anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 new citizens with their family members at those ceremonies. And the speakers who usually are asked by the federal judge to speak give just inspiring speeches. But looking around the room, seeing the new citizens with their families, who to them, probably next to actually coming to America, becoming a citizen is the most important thing in their civic life. And at those ceremonies, the League of Women Voters encourages everybody to register to vote so they can vote in an election. And usually they have anywhere from 80 to 90% of the new citizens and their family members, if they're citizens, sign up to register to vote. So it's an inspiring ceremony that kind of goes back again to the immigrant experience of coming to this country and then becoming a part of this country. And if you ever get a chance, any of you, to go to those citizenship ceremonies, please do so. One other thing to the lawyers in the audience, please consider this topic of how we treat immigrants in this country and how they've been treated in the past. There are many, many pro bono opportunities for lawyers here in Houston and Harris County to help immigrants. And please, if you have any interest in doing so, contact our office, and we can then relay your information to the appropriate entity that you're interested in helping, or contact them directly. So with that, let me introduce the MC for today. Terry ORourke, as most of you know, has been a long-time assistant county attorney. He served in many different capacities. For my old boss, Mike Driscoll, he served for 10 years in that office. Before that, he has been involved as an assistant attorney general in the state of Texas. He's worked in the White House. Terry, I tease that one thing about us getting more mature in years is our stories get longer and longer. Well, Terry's a little bit older than I am, so his story is a little bit longer than mine. But I think most of you here today to hear our great speaker, Chase Untermeyer. So with that, let me turn the program over to Terry. And please, everybody, keep on eating as we do the program. Thank you.
Thank you, Vince. And I can really say that sincerely it is a pleasure to serve Harris County, Texas. And I'll never be able to recognize everybody that's here, but the question is, why are we here? And one of them is because the focal point of this entire trilogy is the book, The Train to Crystal City. And we're here because the archivist of Harris County, Texas, who's right here on the front row, Sarah Jackson, called me up and said, when this thing came out, the entire program of Gulf Coast Reads, which is a program of all the libraries along the Gulf Coast of Texas, of which the Harris County Library family is a part of, and our library, the Harris County Law Library, is an active participant, that we needed to put the law into the story, and so that's what we're doing. And of course, Mary Ann Sears, who's responsible for that, and Joe Lawson, who is directly responsible for making this program be a success. This, for us, is a follow-up for something that we did 2 years ago on the rights of unaccompanied children crossing the Texas border, about the duties of all of us in trying to get pro bono lawyers to represent children. So if there's any outcome of this, other than you getting 3 hours of CLE credit for the trilogy, these 3 parts, is please become a pro bono lawyer. The part that I want to try to get to, and we have, and you'll see here the promo here is Kids in Need of Defense, which you'll find is a part of just one of the organizations of which you have an opportunity to serve. And like Vince said, this is the middle of the trilogy. For you who missed the first one, we had Charles Foster, a nationally and internationally recognized expert on immigration. And the first part, or the first series, which you can still get credit for if you go to look at our website, we'll have that all up, free CLE. Foster talks about the future, how we got to where we are, but what the future has to be. So in the next session of Congress, there is going to be an immigration reform bill, and all of you in some way are going to be a part, or can be a part of that. Today, Chase Untermeyer, Ambassador Untermeyer, and I are going to talk about the past. And then in the third series next week, Jan Jarboe Russell herself will be here to talk about her book, The Train to Crystal City. And we will have our Special Assistant County Attorney who's here, Julie Countess. Julie is one of the superwomen who, during her regular day job, fights human trafficking and drug enterprises, is a mother to children, and then in her spare time is a pro bono lawyer. And so she will be encouraging you of how you can serve. So the first part of this is me giving you the short history about the law. The book itself is just a fascinating, for you who haven't read the book, and lots of lawyers out there haven't read the book, get it and read it. It is a great book. It reads easily. It's written by a journalist. And for those who have to get bait to do it, go to YouTube video and just check out on the YouTube, because there's a 46-minute version of the author herself talking a lot about the book. When she talks to us next week, it's going to be even more in detail and even more entertaining. The aspect of those who haven't read it, it reads like a Steven Spielberg movie. Anybody who saw Schindler's List or Saving Private Ryan, you can just see the scenes in here with Eleanor Roosevelt talking to Franklin about the Japanese people who are good American citizens, or you can see this hot desert area of South Texas and Crystal City, or you can see the scenes in Washington of the intrigue that goes on, or even the visualization of a wonderful period piece 1940s movie is already here. And I don't know who's going to do the movie, but this book is made to be a movie, and as you read it, you can just have it run in your mind. So what I want to talk about here briefly is the law. And the law on immigration is such that as you see it, it reads a little bit like the book The Trial by Kafka. When you see what it's like for these people caught in the system, and Jan Russell captures it well. What we caught in here were the cases that stood out to us that are important for you to take a look at and understand. And they're a story of Hans and Frieda Ackerman. They are not featured in the book, but they were definitely at Crystal City. And so here I want to ask this one question to all of you in Chicago and everywhere else who are watching this. If somebody had said to you, did you know that there was a concentration camp in Texas in World War II that had thousands of women and children, men, women, and children for families? How many people would have known that before this CLE? How many people would have known about that concentration camp? Well, I sure didn't hardly. I mean, it's a part of rediscovering a history. But sometimes we lawyers see history through cases. So you will get the book, but in the book are two people who are a part of this, and that's Hans and Frieda Ackerman. They were married in Germany in 1923. They legally immigrated to the United States through New York and Galveston, like so many other stories here. They applied for citizenship but didn't go through it completely. Hans bought ownership in a newspaper in Taylor, Texas, and a lot of you know there are lots of Germans in Texas and lots of Germans in Central Texas, and that is one of the reasons we have such good barbecue and good music and other things. Anyway, they had that Taylor Herald, and they began yet again to their citizenship application, which was completed in 1939. Well, of course, one of the things that happens in December 1941 is a war. And it is clear when you read the case that they came to the attention of the House Un-American Activities Committee. For any of you who don't know that period, we had a period of anti-immigrant behavior and led by a congressman from Texas by the name of Martin Dies, who had a committee on House Un-American Activities, and the Ackermans came to his attention. And there's a part in here of the testimony they had in Austin, Texas in 1940 in their history. But that's really a prelude to what happened to them, because Hans and Frieda their citizenship was revoked. And you can read that case in the U.S. versus Ackerman, 53 Fed Sup 611, 1943. And of course, without their citizenship, they were immediately detained by the FBI and made enemy aliens under the order of the U.S. Attorney General, and they got a trip to Crystal City. The authority for this goes way, way back. And those of you who've read your American history, and Charles Foster talked about it, and I think Chase is going to speak about it a little bit, goes all the way back to President John Adams of the United States, of course, on the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, which is alive and well. And there is a part of our American political history which is to persecute, detain, deport your enemies, especially if they are born in a foreign country. The authority of that law was part of the authority which President Roosevelt used in the proclamations. 2525 was related to Japanese, and 2526 was related to Germans after Pearl Harbor, so that German people of German descent would become enemy aliens. Now, the fascinating part of this, as you read through this history, for me is for all of us who know the story of December 7th, 1941, about being unprepared and caught off guard, boy, it is sure clear that Franklin Roosevelt and J. Edgar Hoover were not caught off guard. They were all ready to go, and the book really makes that clear about how the United States government was ready to war when it came. And so you see the roundup occurring in Galveston in days after the Pearl Harbor. But the one that's most amazing is 2526, which relates to Germans, is signed on December 8th, is before Germany declares war on the United States. That Roosevelt takes that authority, that he thinks it's coming, and so forth, he declares it. And boy, a whole series of things come into effect. Now, it doesn't take a genius to know that we have a war on drugs and a war on terror. And you can take a look at what happens when there is fear in this country, but the authority that you see so profoundly and decisively exercised by the executive branch is one for every lawyer, every citizen who looks at this, to take a real deep breath to make sure that we don't recreate the things that are occurring. So take a look at what happens is once the Ackermans were detained, they were sent to Crystal City without a hearing, as were many, many other people. And there's a story in the Austin Statesman that you'll find here about how that happened to Hans and Frieda. And then after they were detained for 2 years in the camp, they file a writ of habeas corpus against the one guy who's a hero in the story, and it caught my attention because it's Ackerman versus ORourke, and it's Joseph ORourke who's in charge of the camp. Now, we haven't connected the dots to find out how Uncle Joe and I are related. But like most immigrant Irish ORourke family, we came through New York on our way to Texas. And he really is a hero. And I speak to all the government servants who I know, public servants here, hoping that if times turn badly, that you would have the elegance and the dignity that Joe ORourke does, a sense of true compassion for the people who are going through a horrific condition. He was doing more than just following orders, and it was not just the compassion for children, like getting ice cream for children who were on the train in terrible heat. He thought about something. If any of you have been to South Texas, Crystal City is only really known for the statue of Popeye because it was the spinach capital of the United States, but it is hot and it is dry. And I promise you, in the middle of World War II, it was not air conditioned. So Joe ORourke took a stock tank and turned it into a swimming pool for the kids. And I try to think about, in my own government service, we've got a jail over here with 9,000 or 10,000 people in it. What is Terry ORourke doing to help those people? And probably not enough. And a kind of a call to all of us as public servants of how do we exercise our duties. Well, the case of Ackerman versus ORourke goes on, and while they were appealing their internment, they also filed a denaturalization challenge. And this case of the Ackerman versus the United States did go to the Supreme Court, and cert was granted, and the result of it is something that lives with us today. It's called the Ackerman Rule, and that is the question about how much excuse do you have, what is excusable neglect when you're filing essentially an appeal. Remember, the Ackermans are in a concentration camp, and their capacity to appeal an order is limited. There are other cases which are even worse. The Supreme Court does turn around the Clapperpot case versus the United States. Clapperpot was a draft dodger, and while he was moved around in various jails, the United States filed denaturalization against him, and because he didn't get served, they took a default judgment against him. And so because he was in jail for as draft dodger and didn't get served, he became an enemy alien and then subject to deportation. So try to pick that one up as a lawyer, and if you've ever read Franz Kafka, you could get that picture, but bless the Supreme Court of the United States, it does turn that around. And so there are tests about how down and out in Baton Rouge do you have to be in order to get mercy, to be able to essentially file an appeal after your time for appeal is run, and whatever you call it, a bill of review or habeas corpus or whatever. When are they going to consider it? And the Ackermans didn't make the cut. There's a wonderful dissent in the case, and I'm a fan of Justice Douglas and Justice Frankfurter, and you read their dissent, but they did not prevail, so that the Ackerman Rule goes to this very day. It's a high standard, which you'll see. So the law lives on after them. So one of the questions is, that Hans and Frieda lost, L-O-S-T, and what happened to them. Other people were deported, and I'm not going to get ahead of the story, but it is not a good story of why these people were detained, but essentially they were essentially material to be used in trades for higher value citizens, and it will give you a cold-blooded feeling about how the United States sacrifices citizens of the United States in its own interest. Anyway, the Ackermans didn't get deported. You know how sometimes the legal history looks one way and the actual real history is another, whether it's the Dred Scott case or any other case, or Lawrence v. Texas, or any of the other Roe v. Wade, whatever, like the real history versus the legal history. Well, the Ackermans, even though they lost 100% in the legal process, were not deported. They both died in Texas, and they both died in Central Texas. I don't know their full story, but it's a heck of a story, and I hope you'll see it. So that's the end of my law part of it, but I get the joy now, switching very quickly, to introduce a guy who I've known for more than 50 years, and I have respected and revered, and I think been a friend of his for all that time, and it's Chase Untermeyer. Chase is he's known as Ambassador Untermeyer, or Your Excellency, or whatever, because he served as the ambassador to Qatar, Q-A-T-A-R, spelled for everyone, and from 2007 for 3 years. He has worked at all level of government, both as county, Harris County. He worked for John Lindsay. He's been a state representative, and of course he served in the United States, which I'll get to, in international service. I knew him where he was a debater at Spring Branch High School, and famous guys were from Lamar were like Mike Driscoll and Dan Hedges, right, on this team. We're going back way time. Nobody cares about the past, but we're speaking about the past today because our job is to talk about the past, and next week it's about the present. The future was last week with Foster. Chase has had so many distinguished things that he's done, it's hard for me to list them all, except to say that he's a veteran of the Vietnam War, served distinguished service in the United States Navy. He was a reporter for the Houston Chronicle during that time. He interviewed me when I was an assistant attorney general. He served 2 terms in the Texas House of Representatives. He is a colleague and friend of James Baker, one of the other distinguished international figures out of Houston. He's been to China and been in zillions of countries with the President of the United States. He was appointed Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He was the head of planning for Vice President Bush on the transition to the Reagan administration. He's written 3 books, which are really memoirs of his time in the Reagan-Bush administration. The first one is When Things Went Right, which is a clever name, When Things Went Right. And in it, he quotes Terry O'Rourke, so you know he can't be all bad. In my visit to him, the other books are Inside Reagan's Navy, Zenith in the White House of George H.W. Bush, and then he's also got a book which is called how important people act behaving yourself in public. And of course, one of the things we know as a Democrat as I am, we know that the Republican nominee for president has not read Chase's book. Anyway, Chase has had so many other titles that are important. I can't name them all, but he was the head of the Voice of America, which I just grew up listening to the Voice of America on shortwave radio, where he was in charge of radio TV Marti, speaking the voice of freedom into Cuba. He has been on the board of the Naval Academy of the United States. Without going through, he has this wonderful wife, Diana, who is terrific as an author herself, and a wonderful child now, and not so long a child, Ellie, who is at Stanford University. But you may have read about him in yesterday's paper, because this is not a story about the past. He is the chair of the State Ethics Commission and is in one hell of a fight with a lot of people in Austin, including the Lieutenant Governor. With that, I bring you Charles Chase Untermeyer.
Well, thank you, Terry, not only for the introduction, but for making this session legitimate, because under the rules of CLE, you don't get any credit unless a real lawyer talks to you, and you just got it. The illustrations, one of which has just popped on the screen, will illustrate only one episode of American history in which immigration has played a role, but I thought it might be useful to start looking at the Washington Monument early in the talk. Most of the time when people give talks about immigration, they always show the Statue of Liberty for obvious reasons. But my contention is, and I hope we'll make this point clear in just a few moments, that the Washington Monument is really the physical embodiment of the immigration issue in America. I will get to that remarkable story, and I'll tell you in advance that if you've been to Washington, I suspect most of you have, and you've looked at the Washington Monument, how many times have you noticed, if at all, that it has got two tones? Namely, at about the 1/3 point, it changes from being a kind of a lighter sandstone to a darker sandstone. And that, too, is part of this story I'll get to. The aim of my talk this afternoon is to talk about the abiding power of the immigration issue in American history and American politics. In other words, it didn't just start with Donald Trump. In fact, the first immigrant targets in American politics were who? Mexicans? Arabs? Jews? No, they were the French. And it all ties into this Alien and Sedition Act that Terry made mention and made us all remember is still on the books somewhere. And this takes us back to that very historic year of 1789. It was historic in Europe because that was the beginning of the French Revolution, historic in America because it was the first year under the Constitution and the year that not only did George Washington take office as president, but John Adams took office as vice president and Thomas Jefferson as the U.S. Secretary of State. To talk about that period would be an entire luncheon, and I'm not going to dwell more than to say that when the French Revolution began, Thomas Jefferson felt almost a personal ownership. He thought it was an embodiment of Europe copying America, the words of the Declaration of Independence, which, truth to tell, he based upon the writings of French thinkers such as Montesquieu and Rousseau. But Thomas Jefferson identified with the French Revolution even when the French Revolution turned rather nasty. Meanwhile, his great rival in politics, John Adams, and the rest of the Washington administration were, if anything, pro-British in the dust-up that began soon thereafter, which we know as the Napoleonic Wars. There was no particular fondness for Britain. It's just that the Federalist Party was more impressed by the way the British conducted themselves than the French with their guillotine and directory and all the nastiness that flowed from the French Revolution. Well, it was indeed French émigrés or refugees who came to America by the thousands after 1789. Some 25,000 French people came to this country, and this was when the United States had maybe 2 or 3 million people. So in today's discussions over whether we should take in Syrians in the numbers of a few tens of thousands, you can imagine the percentage impact of 25,000 French people. Not all of them came from France. Some of them came from the West Indies, where there were not only political issues, but slave uprisings and various other local conditions that caused people to settle in America. And when they settled, the thought began, and this begins to sound like modern politics, but my point is it's been American politics ever since 1789. It began to seem that these aliens were not loyal to the United States and needed to be controlled. So we got in 1798, when John Adams was president, the Alien and Sedition Act. The Alien Act allowed the U.S. government to deport anybody who was deemed dangerous, not defined. And the sedition part was the part that really didn't relate to these immigrants, but had to do with anybody or anything that was critical of the president, the president's administration, or the Congress. It is rather frightening to know that these two statutes are still on the books. Fortunately, they were never exercised in the time of John Adams. Let's see, we're going ahead of the story here, or ahead of the slides. When we get down to why the passions began to affect the Washington Monument, we have to advance the story to the 1840s. In the 1840s, it was decided by proper citizens of Washington that there should be a memorial to the man for whom the city was named, the father of our country. There was a committee put together. It was a private entity. That was the whole idea. It was not to be federally funded by U.S. appropriations, and the most that any one citizen could give would be $1 toward the Washington Monument Building Society. They got the most prominent architect of his day, Mr. Robert Mills, the designer of the Treasury Department and the building called the U.S. Patent Office, where the U.S. Portrait Gallery and the U.S. National Museum of American Art are located in Washington. He designed this Washington Monument. It was in the classic style, that is, it had an obelisk, but it also had this pavilion around the base of it that was to be topped by a statue of George Washington looking like this in Roman robes. But Robert Mills was indeed the great architect of his day. They accepted the design. They went forward to begin to raise money. And in addition to gathering money, they also gathered stones. There were commemorative stones given by cities, states, guilds, and foreign countries. You can see these stones on the inside of the Washington Monument. They're not on the exterior, but to this day, you go inside the monument, and there are the commemorative stones. Well, one of the stones was given by the head of state of something called the Papal States. The Papal States, in those days, ruled by the Pope, covered a rather large chunk of central Italy. It wasn't just the little Vatican City, and which made the Pope a temporal ruler as well as a spiritual ruler. Well, this highly incensed the group that was gaining power in the 1840s, calling themselves the American Nativist Movement. The better known name were the Know-Nothings, because they were a secret organization, and when asked what to tell us about the American Nativist Movement, they'd say, "I know nothing." So that became their name. They became a very major political force, and they targeted this insult that they saw to the country by having the Pope in Rome give a stone to the memory of George Washington. Now, they felt particularly incensed about the Pope because at that time, the 1840s and 50s, America was receiving immigrants by the tens of thousands from Ireland because of the Great Potato Famine. All these people named O'Rourke and Ryan were coming into our country, and by definition, because they were Catholics, they owed their allegiance, said the nativists, to the Pope in Rome, the man who insulted George Washington's memory by giving the stone. So what they did was to take over the Washington Monument Building Society, and when they had control of the property, they removed the stone given by the Pope, threw it in the Potomac River where it has never been found. And this created such a hullabaloo that the Washington Monument stopped being built. This was roughly in the year 1855, and it remained like this for 25 years. Some of the blocks of stone that were brought onto the property to be raised in the obelisk, remained there for a quarter of a century. The story is told how Union soldiers used these big blocks of stone to cut meat and do their laundry and write letters, and they remained like that until after the Civil War. There are wonderful lithographs of what Washington looked like in the immediate post-Civil War era, and you'll see this stubby Washington monument there, which was a great national embarrassment. So it was decided finally that in order to put this project back to what it should be, a few things would be done. Number one is that they would get a congressional appropriation. Number two is that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, then as now renowned for their skill in building things, would do the job, but because taxpayer money was to be used, they did away with all the frippery of the Robert Mills design, the pavilion, the statue of George Washington. This is what I call a gift to art from politics, because the Washington Monument that began to be built is the monument we know today. Namely, its very elegance, its power comes from its simplicity. If it had the pavilion, if it had the statue of George Washington, it would be dated, maybe even derided to this point. But the Washington Monument we know has that great strength. Well, government contracts being what they are, they went back to the quarry in Maryland where the sandstone had come from to finish the project. And over a quarter of a century, the quarry had been dug down to a level such that the tone of the stone was darker. This picture is correct, except they've reversed the color. That is, it looks like the darker stone is on the bottom, whereas it's really on the top. And that's why when we go back through this run of pictures, you'll see that that point divides or points out the moment in history when, as a result of the big hullabaloo over immigration, the Washington Monument became two-toned. Well, that's a story in more depth than I'm going to be able to give you as we rush through the succeeding decades. But to make the point once again, each one of these has very involved, very fascinating, not always very complimentary points to be made about the way Americans have reacted to immigrants, the French, the Irish, and then later the next group to hit were the Chinese, who were brought in to blast through the mountains of the Sierra Nevada to build what became known as the Southern Pacific Railroad, while what became known as the Union Pacific Railroad was moving from east to west to finally link America. The Chinese came by tens of thousands. They stayed in California and became a political issue there. Here were hardworking people who, among other things, were willing to go up into the mountains and to carry containers of nitroglycerin, because dynamite had not been invented to stabilize nitroglycerin, so that they were constantly being killed. And the expression Chinaman's chance comes from that period of American history in the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. So these people took on that huge risk to help the new United States of America get unified, and they stayed. But in California, they remained a political problem. And then they were followed by the Japanese, who came to the United States in particular in the years when Japan began to develop, and Japan at that time was thought to be overpopulated. So there was a definite incentive on the part of the government of Japan to do two things. One is to encourage immigration. So great numbers of Japanese came to Hawaii, to California, to South America, and other countries. And Japan began its period of colonial expansion, taking over places like Taiwan and Korea, and later other pieces of territory in order to set out their people. In 1906, the school board of San Francisco created a separate school system for Japanese. There were only 93 Japanese in the San Francisco school system, but this was such an outrageous act of segregation that it incensed the government in Tokyo, and there was actually talk of war between Japan and the United States in 1906. Theodore Roosevelt was very sympathetic to the Japanese on this. He talked about the infernal fools in California. So again, nothing is new. The infernal fools in California insult the Japanese recklessly and might cause war. What it led to was a so-called gentleman's agreement by which the Japanese, on their own motion, limited immigration. And as I mentioned, they had other ideas for those people, which was to staff their expanding territory. Meanwhile, as we know, millions and millions of immigrants were coming into the United States from Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. And this is when you normally see the picture of the Statue of Liberty and people on the ships waving their hats, happy to see Lady Liberty. But as grand a part of our history as that is, it definitely sparked yet another, and I would say deeper, reaction politically against immigrants. Many of those from the Russian Empire, which includes today's Poland and Lithuania, were Jews who had very socialist, even Marxist leanings. That was a minority, but they were seized upon, particularly in the period after World War I, as a dangerous alien force. Everything that Terry was telling you about the House Un-American Activities Committee was correct, but the HUAC was actually formed in the 20s. And John McCormick, who many of people may remember later became Speaker of the House, was an early chairman of the early House Un-American Activities Committee. And just like the episode involving the internment of the Japanese is not a compliment upon the Franklin Roosevelt administration, what I'm describing was definitely not a compliment on the Woodrow Wilson administration, particularly because in that moment, Woodrow Wilson was incapacitated, and his Attorney General, a man named William Palmer, took it out to begin to remove some of these aliens from Eastern Europe. This was called the Palmer Raids. They were stimulated by the bombing in Wall Street, an act of terrorism in 1919 that convinced people all the more, especially in the aftermath of the creation of the Soviet Union only 2 years earlier, that these people needed to be removed from the United States, and many were. Then there were the Italians. The Italians had two things going against them from a public relations point of view. Number one was the notion that there were many people involved with the Black Hand movement, which was an early name for what later became known as the Cosa Nostra, the mob, the mafia, very much involved in extortion rackets. And then there were a large number of Italian Americans who were anarchists by philosophy. Anarchism was the terrorist movement of the turn of the 19th and 20th century. This was the period in which, in the opinion of anarchists, you could make things happen by killing leaders of countries. And there was the death of our own president, William McKinley, the Empress of Austria, the president of France. The list went down of the number of people who were killed by anarchists in that particular period, which created a very familiar circumstance of deep concern in the United States about how to protect ourselves against these people. Well, the answer was you deport them or you otherwise get rid of them. And the most famous movement case on the left in the 1920s in the United States was that of two Italian immigrants named Sacco and Vanzetti, who were accused of having killed a bank guard. To this day, there's controversy as to whether they did it, but the key thing is they were executed in Massachusetts for that crime. And this captivated and crystallized sentiment against the Italians in that particular period. So I'm just about finished with all of this, but you can tell that there is practically no period of American history that has not been seized by political reaction to immigration. In our own time, Jan Jarbo Russell speaks eloquently about what happened to the Japanese. In our own time, we've seen calls for action against immigrants, such as after the fall of Saigon in 1975, the United States began to receive hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese immigrants. And Houston, Texas was an epicenter of that immigration. I well recall many people, because I was then working in the Harris County Courthouse, saying that this is an outrage. They were very angry at President Ford for allowing these people to come, because how could they be American citizens? This is the same echo of how could somebody named ORourke be an American citizen and really love this country if they came from a different culture, did not worship a familiar God, and did not speak our language. Well, we all know that within half a generation, the sons and daughters of those immigrants were valedictorians in our high schools. So they were able to become citizens and productive citizens of a high order within our own memory. And in conclusion, I would say that we hear echoes in our politics today about possible immigrants from any country where wars and economic distress cause people to want to come here. This is not to say that there should be open borders, no restrictions, no vetting, if I can coin a phrase, to try to see who is coming into our country. But one thing we know for sure from the history of our country, and that is that the vast, vast majority of these people are coming for the right reasons and will become great citizens. And the minority who commit crimes of one sort or another, well, there are laws that allow the government properly to go after those people who have taken advantage of the hospitality of our country. But they are the minority. Going back to the French, or going back to the Black Hand people, or the anarchists of the early 1920s. So we can be assured of the fact that this is not going to end. Perhaps if there is an end, it's because there's no part of the world left that doesn't send people to the United States. So in the past, there have been these new waves of people from different countries, but now pretty much the whole world can come and is trying to come to the United States. The argument that these people cannot understand our culture is mocked by our modern life, because I would bet that the poorest person from Bangladesh who somehow comes to the United States, legally or illegally, knows more about American culture and might even know our language than the people who came in earlier waves from nations like Poland or Italy. That is the benefit, or the global curse, if you will, of the spread of popular American culture. Well, I'm going to stop here and to thank you all for your patient listening to this talk, and we now return you to our sponsor, Mr. ORourke.
I forgot to mention that he went to Harvard, and you can see it, and he's a brilliant lecturer, and we're so thankful. So we got questions, and I don't know, Joe, if we've got questions from Chicago coming in yet, but
still waiting on those.
Still waiting. Here we have the Chicago Bar Association, which is participating in this, and we have questions for Ambassador Untermeyer or anyone else from the room. Barbara Ann.
What about today? What are your feelings today of the ambassador?
Yeah, I think
Well, I sort of indicated that I do believe in immigration. I think it's a healthy thing for the United States. I think history is clear that we have grown as a result and are a model for the world of how to take people from different parts of the world and all kinds of cultures, people who are here voluntarily and people who came here involuntarily, such as that large percentage of our country who are African American, did not choose to come here, have all made for the richness and fabric of our country. So I think that is good, but it isn't in conflict with that sentiment and that truth to say that there needs to be a system for processing people and to have secure borders or control of the border. I do believe that both political parties, frankly, are at fault for the failure to pass some kind of greater comprehensive system for controlling the border. And I say that because it's in their political advantage. It's in the advantage of the Republican Party to talk about open borders and crazed people coming across those borders to commit crimes, because that's criticism of the incumbent Democratic administration, and it definitely excites their political base. And the Democratic Party has kept the issue going because it's very convenient for them to point to the Republicans as being anti-immigrant, and in particular anti-Hispanic. Nevertheless, there is the possibility and the hope, as Terry ORourke mentioned, that next year maybe our nation can take a breath and finally enact some kind of legislation. Now, there are certain controversies that we all know about which do not of themselves invite compromise. On abortion, let us say, you're either pro-choice or pro-life. There's nothing in between. On stem cell research, it's very much the same thing. On prayer in schools, all these are very much one way or another kinds of issues. But immigration, it strikes me, is one on which both sides will say, yes, we need to have some kind of system for policing, controlling, monitoring the border. And yes, we need the labor. We need to put these people to work. And in fact, those people are at work. And how can we continue to have an economy if we don't have people willing to do the roofing and fixing the streets and washing the dishes and all those other kinds of initial jobs that people who are immigrants take? If both sides are willing to admit to those particular positions, then in theory, there is a potential for compromise. There is something in between that will allow for national legislation. But to say again, as long as it's just too delicious a political issue not to solve, it will continue to gnaw us.
But right now you have one side saying we should have a religious test. A religious test. If you're Muslim, don't come in and we're going to treat you differently because of your religious faith. Surely you see a distinction there.
Yes, well, I would say that that's not necessarily the entire one-side opinion. That is, is part of one side's opinion. And I agree that the Constitution is pretty clear. Well, the Constitution says there's no religious test for public office. But we also tend to believe that the government has no role in restricting religion, and that would be a very major restriction. So that clearly cannot go, or at least I presume that these courts of law, staffed by lawyers who have attended CLE classes taught by real lawyers, will be able to act on that rather than just my saying so. Yes, please.
This is something that I thought about last week and you really haven't discussed. And that's the whole question of what is a citizen of this country. Because if people can be naturalized and then have that citizenship taken away, at what point could someone take my citizenship away? I'm native born. Can they do that? I mean, how far can the government go to attack our citizenship?
That's for you.
Well, it depends if you came over here pregnant and had a baby and, for the purpose of making it a citizen, according to the Republican nominee. The answer to your question is if you're born here, there are very few things that can take away your citizenship, typically acts which renounce your citizenship. So the likelihood of anything, any act of Congress or any act of the president by executive order of taking away your native-born citizenship is real close to zero. And these naturalization cases that you read through, which are chilling, the Ackerman case being one of it, and I ask all those who haven't read that district court opinion, they go through how the Ackerman state of mind, because they were printing a newspaper, and the newspaper had certain articles which were pro-German, talking about that Germans are more than a nation, they're a people. And so the question is, if you believe that, if you believe that the blood of the German people is which you have your fealty, then you have not actually taken an oath to the United States. Therefore, your oath to the United States was fraudulent, so you never really were a citizen of the United States, so your citizenship is revoked because of the fraud that you committed in the very act. It's a little bit like we Roman Catholics do on when we annul marriages. We don't have divorce, we have annulment. So that's the path that they do of taking away for naturalized citizens. And it's not a pretty picture, and that's part of why this CLE is, you read this and it'll scare the hell out of you. It really will. If times turn and you get an attorney general that decides that he or she wants to do it, and you get a Supreme Court that'll put up with it, it could happen to people who were not born here. Because it's happened before.
Right. Yes, we need to get people back to work.
What else? We got more questions. We got a little more time. Do we have anybody from Chicago there, Joe, asking questions?
They're so shy.
We have Senator and Congressman Craig Washington, who always has questions here in the back. I want to just recognize him for a moment, the distinguished member of law. And then also Vic Driscoll, distinguished attorney and famous for many reasons, including being an assistant district attorney, but being the brother of the great Mike Driscoll, who was in many ways the gold that Vince and we all talk about as the gold standard of county attorneys. Barbara Ann, another question.
Back to the issue of the disputes nowadays, if you just isolated it to the person who happens to be running for president for one side, Mr. Trump, can you make any other comments about, I mean, I don't know how constrained you are, but
I'm a private citizen.
Well, he is also a terrific diplomat, if you haven't seen that already. Chase, please go on.
very interesting.
Speak into the microphone, Sue.
You're about as high level as we've heard from in quite a while, and if you would just say what you think, I would be very interested in hearing.
It doesn't pollute CLE to talk politics?
It
we
does
hope?
not, no,
Okay,
not for
very
this
good.
purpose. We've laid the framework here that
Education.
this is education.
Yes, thank you. Well, if you ask about me personally, it won't surprise many people hearing my biography that I supported somebody else in the Republican primary, Jeb Bush in particular, who I have known for decades and considered a thoroughgoing, outstanding governor and a man who actually knows issues. And I went up to New Hampshire and sloshed through snow for several days on his behalf. And I'm sorry to say that people were not buying what he was selling, or for that matter, what anybody else other than Mr. Trump. That was their choice, and then it was later the choice of the Republican National Convention. I personally remain a member of the Republican Party, and in fact, I'm supporting two former Republican governors who are running for president, namely Gary Johnson and Bill Weld, who are happening to be running on the Libertarian ticket. Now, I'm not embracing them on philosophic grounds because I think that libertarianism is sort of half wonderful, half crazy. And it depends whether you're a liberal Democrat or a conservative Republican, which half you would define that way. But I do know Bill Weld personally. He and I met during the Reagan administration. He was an assistant attorney general when I was an assistant secretary of the Navy. And I have great regard for him. In fact, along with a small group, I hosted him here in Houston in September. I don't know Governor Johnson, but I think both men are honorable, and nobody has said that they are to be questioned on their moral character or fiber. So I look upon that as an honest vote. I feel very upset not to be able to cast a vote for a major party candidate, but that's what I'm doing. Look.
Ambassador, could you please tell us more about the international reaction to the immigration question? For example, Mexico, the idea of building a bigger wall between our countries and Europe and so on. The Syrian influx in Europe is causing a lot of problems. How does the rest of the world view our possibility of closing our borders and not allowing immigrants in our country?
Yes, on that subject, there are lots of countries, not just the United States, that are shuffling their feet nervously over the episode that's happening in Syria. This is even apart from the question of what is to be done with the nation of Syria and its conflict and its human tragedies, both physical and emotional. But just the reaction that the United States, Western Europe, and the wealthier Arab countries have to this particular issue. Western Europe is, of course, feeling the immediate impact, and I suspect that we've only begun to see the political reaction there. That is, already certain nations, Hungary, Austria, have been voting for what could be called nativist parties that are concerned about immigrants. I don't say that they are wrong, because amongst tens and tens of thousands of immigrants, there are bound to be some bad characters and even agents of terrorism. I don't think you can say that about the children or their mothers for the vast majority. But you cannot ever discount in any country the power of anxiety, of fear, of uncertainty that comes from having large numbers of people from a totally alien society. Now, it may mean very little, but many of the immigrants from Syria are professional people who are physicians and educators and business people. Many of them are also Christian, not Muslim. So that is a fact that seems to be lost in a lot of the debate. Well, that's just Europe. In the case of the United States, we have, of course, been a nation of immigrants, and we have the capacity to absorb large numbers. But given our current politics and the particular sensitivity to terrorism and the fact that very likely or possibly amongst tens and tens of thousands of people there will be some who do not come with warmest feelings toward the United States or its culture, that some kind of screening is required. Now, screening goes on. Screening has always gone on in the embassies and consulates of the United States around the world. It all comes back to the junior officer of early assignment foreign service officer who has to stand at the window and look at somebody and try to make a guess as to whether that person is telling the truth when they say that they are only coming to the United States to visit a family member or to go to Disneyland or otherwise turn around and go back. And the whole system in the State Department, I can tell you, being a political appointee, not a career foreign service officer, is geared toward supporting that vice consul at the window in the embassy and not questioning her or his judgment with regard to that person. And I'd like to think most of the time they get it right, but sometimes they get it wrong. There had to be somebody at a window that let in the 19 hijackers who destroyed the World Trade Center and hit the Pentagon and the field in Pennsylvania. But I can tell you that part of that system also exists at the higher levels to avoid having to make these choices. So I think it will probably remain right there in the opinion, the emotions of a 25-year-old, 26-year-old man or woman who's got a first assignment at an embassy to do that screening. I'm not quite sure what enhanced vetting or extreme vetting equals versus what's going on now, but to the degree there can be more questions asked and better methods to determine what people might do if they come to the United States, I'd certainly support. People do lie. And not only do people lie, but it isn't just immigrants, after all, who have caused problems. There have been the sons and daughters of immigrants or people who were not themselves immigrants, but just somehow got radicalized in the United States who have done things such as in San Bernardino and in Orlando. That often is forgotten in our current debate, not that it should be a surprise to us that those little facts are the case. So you could have 100% successful vetting of people coming into the United States as immigrants and still have domestic terrorism. Now, fortunately, we've had, proportionate to the numbers of immigrants we have, including people from Muslim countries, the Arab world in particular, very, very few compared to Europe, where their social problems, I suspect, have generated those sentiments more than their politics or their lack of screening. And we, happily, to this day at least, are a country that does try to incorporate people, and people who come here want to be incorporated. It's sort of the reason I mentioned how modern American culture has permeated the rest of the world, and people want to be part of that culture, want to come to America for good reasons rather than anything malign. So you mentioned in the case of Mexico, which is a different sort of issue, when Mexico invited Mr. Trump down there about a month and a half ago, to me, there's no question as to why that was an attractive opportunity for Donald Trump. It gave him a chance to operate on the world scene and to be, at least temporarily, the co-equal of a head of state, Enrique Peña Nieto. The thing that I could not quite understand is why Mexico did it, and what calculation that President Peña Nieto had when he invited Donald Trump. And I think the answer is that he looked upon, that he secretly wants the election of Donald Trump as president because it will be the gift that keeps on giving in terms of creating delicious opportunities for Mexico to point at the Yankees, once again intruding in Mexican affairs. Now, that's my suspicion, but when there was a reaction against his inviting Trump, you saw that there were members of his administration who got the boot. Maybe they paid the sacrifice for the president's calculation or miscalculation of the political benefit of having Donald Trump on Mexican soil. But we'll see. I mean, that requires two things to happen. Number one, for Mr. Trump to be elected president. Second would be for Mexico to take political advantage of his being there. The reason, part of my cynical interpretation is in my thought, is that if Hillary Clinton is elected president, then once a year there'll be some kind of meeting on either side of the border with lots of mariachis and flowers and warm words, and that will be a one-day story. Whereas if Donald Trump becomes president, there'll be any number of stories that will make for wonderful Yankee bashing south of the Rio Grande.
I think we got it.
Oh, wait, one more there.
I don't really expect you to answer this. This is just as a private citizen who grew up on the border, and I've been around longer than a lot of people in here and seen a lot of politicians come and go. I think everybody underestimated Trump, and I think everybody thought that if they could just meet with him and reason with him and let him see that they weren't the picture that he'd been painting, that we could work things out. And my concern as a citizen is he's unleashed and made fashionable and acceptable hate and prejudice and hostility and distrust in our national institutions. How are we going to deal with this after the election? You're talking about people who are angry, who doesn't matter what he says or does, are going to go forward. How are we going to deal with this as a nation when we all have to work together because we all live here, regardless of whether we're Republicans or Democrats? We're all Americans. So how are we going to deal with this?
Very valid question. I can't speak to after the election. All I can say is that today Mr. Trump tweeted that he's taken off the shackles. He's decided he's not going to be politically correct and nicey nice anymore. And so stand by.
We've got to wrap it up here. Well, thank you. I hope that you're all highly entertained. And I would say one thing as a closing, and gratitude to Vince Ryan, is that the story of immigration. Vince's dad was born in Mexico. We have a brilliant, wonderful young man who came here as a boat person, is now one of the managers in Children's Protective Services. We are a story ourselves. When I grew up, Houston was a segregated city. It was the old South, and it isn't. We are the future. We embrace the diversity, and the diversity is present in this room. It's present. You see it on our city council. Houston is the world. And it's the future that we dream. And thank all of you who are watching live stream throughout the entire world, not just Chicago. Know that we here stand for a future that is different. Thank you.